Hi, Marky. This is Ira. I'm sharing here my voice feedback on your conference paper, but by and large, I'm not sharing the feedback on the conference paper as delivered. Rather, my aim here is to offer some useful thoughts as you move from conference paper to article. So, really, what's at stake here and what my comments are primarily oriented towards is that motion from one type of object, one scholarly genre, the conference paper, to the next type, the journal article. So just kind of, have bear that in mind as I'm commenting. I will say a couple things about just your personal intro here. Which I think it's nice and smart that you wrote out, and I just have a couple quick suggestions for that. So that part is for a conference paper, but the rest of it is thinking about the article. So for this, I think this is perfectly fine. That's a nice way to start. I would avoid in the paper I wrote for today. So I just say things like in this paper or this paper discusses, that sort of thing. So you're less reporting on your own activities and you're more sharing what this object and this scholarly object in the world does. And then the rest of this I think is good. And I'd add, instead of please enjoy, I'd actually add a comment at the end that situates the conference paper relative to the larger scholarly project. So in this case for you, that'll be the article. So instead of asking people to enjoy at the end, you say, so additionally, keeping the concept of failure in mind, I consider rubrics and how these tools, as we call them, can sometimes not allow for failure and therefore meaningful learning to happen. That this argument is part of a larger argument I'm making to the effect that I'm planning to submit this journal article to such and such journal. I'd be especially interested in any feedback or thoughts anybody has in the Q&A on disciplinary questions, yada, yada, yada. That sort of thing. So you want to say, at the end, ask people less about enjoyment. I mean, obviously, we are actually all hoping to enjoy ourselves a little bit. But what you want to direct your audience to in your little intro, your spiel, introducing a conference paper, is less toward enjoyment and more toward the specific activity of scholarly concourse, of feedback and Q&A and discussion and thinking together. So, anyways, those are some thoughts on the spiel introducing the conference paper. Let me go forward into ways of thinking about the paper as a project that you're now moving from one kind of genre to the next kind of genre, from conference paper to journal article. So, I think that the iSearch approach you've taken here, starting off with your own personal experience is perfectly fine, but when you start off in that way, you set us up to read the rest of the article as something that's going to be interwoven with that kind of personal experience. For a way of thinking about what that can look like, I do recommend an article of my own. I got great mentoring on how to write an iSearch piece of scholarship from one of my doc advisors. So that piece is called Reprivileging Reading, and you can find the full PDF of it on my academia.edu website. That was in a journal called Pedagogy. So, and I actually said roughly the same thing to Morgan, and I think I'll be saying roughly the same thing to Franklin. So, and the reason I'm saying this is basically the way to think about personal introductions is either they're woven throughout because this personal story is part of the scholarly story, or cut them. Either or. Both are perfectly fine, but the drop-in personal, which works okay for a conference paper because it's you physically present delivering something to a group of people who are in like physical concourse with you. doesn't really work very well, the drop-in personal anecdote for scholarly work, because nobody cares about you, right? I mean, so we want to situate it. We can situate it in terms of you if we're looking at you and we're listening to you personally, we're sharing space with you. But if we're just reading something on the pages of a journal, then your personal experience only matters if it's an important part of the story. So again, if you want to do that, there's nothing wrong with that at all. To the contrary, it's a totally legitimate, interesting way of writing articles. But if you want to do that, I recommend checking out That Piece of Mine as one model for it. Not the only model, but one model. And if you're not going to tie it in throughout, then I just cut it. Definitely, we want to get in pretty quick here to the larger scholarly conversation. So it's fine to start with let's just assume you're keeping the iSearch kind of approach, the personal narrative, and that's fine. But we want to get pretty quickly for the article into after here, into the scholarly conversation about rubrics. So right now, and this is, again, please don't take my feedback as being on the conference paper per se, but rather on the rhythm of an article, which moves at a different pace than a conference paper. Right now, we move really quickly into the question of meaning. And I want to suggest that actually we've got more to do with failure before we can get there. So I want to encourage you to spend a little more time situating your work in terms of this really substantive scholarly conversation going on right now about failure. And so you're going to be wanting to draw on the relevant journals. You're going to be wanting to pull out specific pieces and try and tell us a little bit of a story about what does the conversation about failure look like right now? What are the opposing viewpoints? What's the doxa? How are people challenging the doxa? How has the doxa been overturned recently? Where do we stand? What's the state of the conversation that you're entering right now? When are we? To think back to the flow chart that I offered you for thinking about writing journal articles. So, in other words, we want to kind of move from your articulation of the argument that you're going to be making into a fuller sense of why this argument for this audience now in this journal. And the way that you do that is in part by telling us about what conversation exactly you're joining. That doesn't have to be super extensive. It doesn't have to be like pages and pages and pages, but you should definitely be thinking of that as 1 to 4 paragraphs, 1 to 5 paragraphs, depending on how much into it you want to get. But definitely, and it should feel kind of natural. You want there to be a strong through line from start to finish. But it should feel natural because it's part of how you're helping us see the meaning of your own work is by helping us see where it fits into the conversation. And I think that's going to help you also move to a stronger articulation of what the argument is. So you're doing more than exploring the relationship between meaningful writing and how rubrics alter a student experience as a failure. That's fine. That's a fine line. But you want to be doing for the article more than just exploring that. Instead, you're going to be actually making an argument about that. And part of how you tell us the story of what argument you're making is by helping us see how you yourself are intervening in an older doxa or helping establish an emerging doxa where your argument fits in the ongoing conversation. And that really wants to come in the first couple pages, first 1 to 5 pages, no later, of the journal article. More broadly, when you're drawing, and I think you draw pretty well on Giudice, Geller, and Lerner, but when you're doing this, I really, really want to strongly encourage you to keep in mind what a high school teacher of mine a long time ago called the 3 Ps, and that's stuck with me ever since because I think it's a really helpful way of revising writing in particular? Am I keeping the 3 P's in mind? So the 3 P's are point, proof, pertinence. And that's a good way to think about when you're introducing quotes from other people, what point of yours are those quotes helping to establish? So those quotes, when you're engaging with Giudice, Geller, and Lerner, you're engaging with them for some reason that's argumentative, that's your own reason, something you want to say about meaning. So tell us up front, what is your point about meaning? And then draw, give us your proof, proof. And then follow up on the quotes by telling us a little bit about what these quotes mean. The proof doesn't explain itself. It needs help. It needs for us to read it the way you want us to read it. It needs your explanation of its pertinence. So help us read both what should we take Giudice, Geller, and Lerner to mean, and also how does that fit in with the point that you want to make here. So for here you do that. So another important aspect of meaningful writing is self-efficacy. So you do that. That's your point. That's the thing that you want to focus on. And then you introduce them really well. And you also explain the pertinence of the quote really well. So that's an example of where you're doing this really effectively. I would say right now, and this is sort of fine for a conference paper, there's only so much space that you actually have, right? You don't have the longer space to really make an argument fully in a conference paper. You just have space to share some insights, and sometimes you just drop in quotes, and that's fine. But moving from the conference paper to the journal article, I want you to look at moments like this paragraph, your own writing in this paragraph, as a good instance of what you should be doing in terms of point, proof, and pertinence. Part of how you keep the through line of a longer piece of writing, establish the continuity of an article, is by making sure that these moments of pertinence are actually followed up even by a fuller sense of how all of this here, this whole paragraph in this instance, fits in with the core argument that you're making. So you want to be using the pertinence part of the 3 Ps repeatedly, not just to establish the pertinence of this proof to your point, but also the pertinence of that whole package to your larger argument. So that the argument kind of develops over time, in part by your repeated articulations of how the different aspects of it fit together relative to the larger whole. Okay? So, and I think that's going to be really helpful, again, as you're moving from the more condensed form of the conference paper to the more expansive form of the journal article, and thinking about how you tell a unifying story start to finish. Right now, there's a little bit of a jumpiness about it. So, for instance, you talk about things that you do in your own classroom, and then boom. However, an aspect of higher education that often inhibits student agency is the use of rubrics. And so we were just kind of jumping from the one thing to the next. And so, again, that's not a criticism of the conference paper per se, but rather a thing that you want to think about really carefully in moving from conference paper to journal article. So one of the ways that I encourage you to do that is by thinking about how to tell the story of, in this case, of rubrics in a way that comes back to the scholarly conversation that you will have set us up with, and that cleanly helps us understand right off the bat what exactly the relationship between meaning and rubrics is, relative not only to Giudice, Geller, and Lerner, but also to that larger scholarly conversation that you will have already told us about. And that's sort of the same throughout. So like now you do a certain amount of kind of literature survey here that works pretty well and is a good amount of literature survey for the classroom. I think one of the things you do really effectively is you say things like, so why were these tools created? And you're not I think it's important, especially in the context of this as an ongoing site of scholarly dispute. I think it's important that you clarify you're not like anti rubric.